मेरी मर्जी का मालिक अली मुर्तज़ा, मेरी कुदरत हुसैन और गसन फातिमा, खल्क पांचों हाँ खल्क पांचों को मैंने किया है मगर फातिमा फातिमा है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है, हाँ मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। तुझ पे खुल जाएगा पड़गदी से किसा, किस तरह पंजतन का तारुफ हुआ। रब ने साबित ये गुम फातिमा से किया, एक ही ज़ात है मरकज़े इन्नमा, खुद मोहम्मद हाँ खुद मोहम्मद भी ज़ेरे किसा है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। हाँ तुझ पे खुल जाएगा, तुझ पे खुल जाएगा पड़गदी से किसा, किस तरह पंजतन का तारुफ हुआ। रब ने साबित ये गुम फातिमा से किया, एक ही ज़ात है मरकज़े इन्नमा, खुद मोहम्मद खुद मोहम्मद भी ज़ेरे किसा है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। एक की खातिर गरम को सजाया गया, एक के हुजरे को क़िबला बनाया गया, एक के बेटे मुसल्ले पे आते रहे, एक को काबे के अंदर बुलाया गया। उम्मे गैदर उम्मे गैदर भी एक फातिमा है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है, हाँ मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। हर नबी हुज्जते किबरिया है, हर नबी हुज्जते किबरिया है, मगर फातिमा फातिमा है, हाँ मगर फातिमा फातिमा है। सल्लु अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद।
Before we begin, if we can recite 5 times, أَمَّيْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ, for Husayn, our mother-in-law of Hassan, Imam, inshallah. If we can recite this for the mu'minah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. اللهم صل على محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه يسبح له فيها بالغدو والآصال. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Respected scholars, elders, brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure to be here serving you, mu'mineen, mu'minat, on this auspicious day, celebrating the Wiladat of Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Which also tells us that it's now, or we are now entering the month of Rajab. When you look at the sources that we have, the narrations from the Ahl al-Bayt, the magnitude of the spirituality that is there within the month of Rajab, it behooves that we pay attention to how we reconnect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many intricacies of ibadat we can apply within our lives. As small as it may be, we ought to reconnect with Allah so that when we enter the month of Ramadan, whatever we have habituated from now, it can be magnified during the holy month of Ramadan, inshallah. The month of Rajab followed by the month of Sha'ban, which then allows us to enter the month of Ramadan. We ought to change certain aspects of our lives during these seasons of ibadah. When we speak about Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam, we find that his lineage goes back to both Imam Hassan as well as Imam al-Husayn. His paternal grandfather was Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, and his maternal grandfather was Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, his wife was Fatima, the daughter of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. And through this marriage, you can imagine this individual, this Imam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, comes from both Sayyid Shababi Ahl al-Jannah. So his magnitude within this world, his existence alone, you find that there is a lot of contributions he made within our madhab. When we speak about his son, Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, Imam Sadiq was able to establish an entire university where he was able to proliferate knowledge amongst his people. Why? Because of Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam. So you find that the preambles that was set by Imam Baqir alayhi salam allowed Shia Islam, the madhab of the Ahl al-Bayt, to expand far and wide. Specifically speaking about Imam Baqir alayhi salam, you find that there were certain internal challenges he faced, as well as external challenges. And this had an impact on the society that he was living in. You see, sometimes when we examine history, we think that this happened 1400 years ago. It's not something that's applicable to us today. It was, or it is, very much so. There are two challenges that Imam Baqir alayhi salam faced. First was an internal problem, the second was an external problem. Both the internal and external issues or challenges he faced led to the same conclusion or led to the same problem. Internally, what happened was it was the time when the Bani Umayyah were very much unstable. There was a lot of instability amongst the ruling authority. And what happened was during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, we all know this. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the one who he reformed certain sunnahs or certain practices that were well established within the Muslim Ummah. On the one hand, you had the la'na that was there for Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Returning fadak to, for example, the Ahl al-Bayt, stopping the la'na, the cursing of Amir al-Mu'mineen. You find that all of these were established by Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. But there is one specific thing that he established as well. He realized that during his time, no one knew what the sunnah of the Holy Prophet was. You had people performing wudu in different ways. You had people performing salah in different ways. No one knew how the Prophet performed wudu or how the Prophet prayed salah. So one of the things he re-established was the writing and the recording of ahadith. This was banned during the time of the first two caliphs. When you look at the reasoning as to why they banned or prohibited the recording of ahadith, you find that there are a number of excuses that are given. One of the most influential excuses or most famous excuses is that we do not want people to follow the sunnah or follow the narrations and to neglect the Holy Quran. Is this justified? Not at all. And you find that there are arguments presented by our scholars. One of the most clear arguments is there is a difference between the words of Rasulullah and the words of the Holy Quran. As in today, if you have a familiarity with the Arabic language, if you were to listen to some of the ahadith and you listen to, for example, the Quran, the language of the two is very, very different. It's impossible for people to forget the Quran and to focus on the narrations of the Ahl al-Bayt. The Quran is preserved, and Allah makes this promise that He is the one who preserves the Holy Quran. But this is a separate discussion and a separate debate. When you ask Fayd al-Kashani rahmatullah alayhi, what was the reason behind the prohibition of the recording of ahadith, he said this was a movement to hide the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. They didn't want the fada'il, the merits of the Imam alayhi salam to spread far and wide. For that reason, they placed an utmost ban on the recording of ahadith. Anyways, he undid this. So many people began to write ahadith. He reached out to some of the scholars, the senior scholars. From amongst them was Muhammad ibn Muslim ibn Abi Zuhra. He was the student, former student of Imam Sajjad alayhi salatu wasalam, but he also had a good connection and a relationship with the Bani Umayyah. So he reached out to certain scholars within Medina, within, for example, Syria, within Mecca, and he asked them to now start compiling narrations to understand and to teach the people what is the sunnah of the Holy Prophet of Islam when it comes to worship, when it comes to areas of ibadat, taharat, najasat, all of these different issues. Internally, what happened was now people began to know openly some of the opinions of the scholars that were there. Variations of different opinions began to come about. When you look at the life of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, internally within the Muslim Ummah, there were many different sects and denominations that came about. On the one hand, you had the Murajji'ah or the Murji'ah. They believed that a person does not have any authority to judge others. It is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who can judge others. We hear this rhetoric today, isn't it? You can't judge me. It's only Allah who can, or only God who can judge me. Is this part and parcel of the ethos of Islam? Absolutely not. Amar bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar is when you judge others. When you judge others, if your actions are not in line with the Sharia and you practice them in front of my children, then I take it personally. I don't want my children to take on the behaviors that you've adopted for yourself. This is Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Beyond that, You had, for example, the Ash'arites, the Mu'tazilites, they came with their own theological thinkings. No one knew what the ma'rif of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant. No one in that time had a correct understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was. In one narration they say that, in one particular narration they say a scholar came towards Imam Baqir alayhi salam, Hasan al-Basri, profound scholar in the city of Basra. A very interesting dialogue. The narration is quite lengthy, but it's a debate that takes place between Imam alayhi salam and Hasan al-Basri. Hasan al-Basri, he comes all the way to the city of Medina and he meets the Imam. When he meets the Imam looks at him and he says, "Are you from the jurists of Basra?" He says, "I am." He says, "Why have you come all the way to the city of Medina?" He says, "I have certain questions regarding the tafsir of the verses of the Holy Quran. I need an interpretation. I can't seem to understand these verses, so perhaps you can enlighten me." The Imam looks at him and he says, "Is there no one else that you can ask in Basra?" He says, "No." He says, "Does that mean that when people have issues, they come to you to seek answers?" He says, "Yes." Very interestingly, the Imam alayhi salam understands that this person is at the top of scholarship. People go to him to seek answers. He doesn't have an answer, so he came all the way to the city of Medina to seek answers. This is the Imam establishing his position as an Imam of Allah, establishing his authority. You're here for a reason, you've approached me for a reason, you've asked a question from me specifically for a reason. There is authority here, and he has to be alerted to it. He says, "Hasan al-Basri, the people have spoken certain things about you. I have heard rumors that you have said certain things." He says, "Like what?" He says, "You have said that Allah has created creation and He has relinquished all affairs to creation." Meaning that Allah has created human beings and He has left them be. The human beings can do whatever they want. Is that the understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ma'rifah of Allah? This is coming from a leading scholar, someone like Hasan al-Basri. The Imam alayhi salam catches him off guard. He says, "Your whole entire understanding of Tawheed is different." So you can understand that the environment that the Imam alayhi salam was part of, people had different interpretations with regards to every aspect of the religion of Islam. This was the first challenge. The second challenge was the futuhat, the expansion of Islam itself. The Bani Umayyah, one of the issues with the Bani Umayyah was they began to expand. They began to conquer different lands, different empires, but they didn't have a plan behind it. They did it for the sake of doing it. So when they conquered different lands, they didn't know what to do afterwards. In our language, in our circumstance, imagine if a person engages in tabligh. You know the du'ats that we have, the YouTube du'ats. They go into hide quarter and they start propagating Islam. They encourage people to become Muslims. Well, that's just there for the sake of it. You want people to come towards the Islam, but what's there after they become Muslims? Is there a system, a network that can support them? That's also fundamental. There's no point bringing people towards Islam and then leaving them to be, because you find that many leave Islam afterwards. So they began expanding the Islamic empire, but they didn't have a practice of what to do afterwards. There was no plan after the expansions. With the expansions, when people were coming towards Islam, along with them, they came with their own ideologies. They came with their own worldviews. They came with their own understanding and the philosophies of life. And slowly, Islam was now being reinterpreted based on their understanding of life. Soon, what happened was within the Muslim Ummah, certain things began to take place where the worldview of the Muslims changed. This change took place not in the time of Imam Baqir, but also in the time of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. When you look at the practices of the Bani Umayyah, the drinking, the womanizing, the music, this all was normalized within society. Imam Baqir alayhi salam saw that there was a threat within the Muslim nation, that outside influences is now changing the perception of Islam amongst the people. How you and I live our lives is based on an ideology. That ideology governs how you connect with your experiences and how you connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The problem that we face today in secular Western societies is that we're shown, we are presented with a worldview that is in contradiction with the worldview of Islam. We're presented with two completely different worldviews. We don't know about this. We're subconsciously interacting with two very different worldviews. On the one hand, secular society has its understanding of life. On the other hand, Islam has its own understanding of life. And we see this contradiction. So what do? We try and reconcile it. Well, let me tell you one thing. There is no methods of reconciliation whatsoever. You and I are now in a position where we pick one or the other. There is no way to bring the two worldviews together. I'll give you a simple example. Music, it's a very simple example. Music, why is music haram? The question itself is a very interesting question. Why is music considered to be haram? Well, why are you asking this question in the first place? Because society allows it, but Islam doesn't allow it. Two different worldviews. See, we're now operating with two worldviews. Can you reconcile it? One allows it, one prohibits it. Is there a method of reconciliation? No. Why is hijab wajib? In Western secular society, if you look at certain European countries, the less clothes you wear, the more power you have as a woman. But within the Islamic paradigm, the more clothes you put on, the more power you have as a woman. The less clothes you have within Western societies, you are respected by society. The more clothes you have within Islam, the more respect is given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is there a reconciliation between the two? There is no reconciliation. So why is hijab wajib? See, we're operating with two completely different paradigms. What happens is we try to influence the Islamic paradigm using secular paradigm. So we start using phrases like, Baba, Islam is outdated. Islam is backwards. Islam, it's as if it wants its people to live in the primitive ages. Not at all. Islam has its own system. Secular society has its own system. You now have to judge and see which system is best for society, for you and I as individuals, for our families, and in the societies that we live in. If you look at secular society and the problems that they go through, they have a list of problems, they have no solutions to it. When you come back to Islam, Islam has all of the solutions. It's just that we don't have the confidence to rely on Islam to say that this is the solution from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're always in the state of opposition. Imam Baqir alayhi salam saw that his people or his community were now being influenced by all of these different practices. Their understanding of Islam changed completely. So he starts to work with the people. And he does so in a number of different ways. He works with his people through akhlaq, for example, through morality, teaching them, guiding them, giving them advices that sticks with them. You see, in one particular narration, it's mentioned that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he had respect for the Ahl al-Bayt, so he called Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam. When the Imam came towards Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he said, Ya ibn Rasulillah, guide me, give me some pieces of advice. See, the beauty of the Imam is that he knows exactly who you are as an individual, and the advice that is directed to you is a very personal advice, something that you can do. And when you act on it, it has a profound effect in how you live your life. He says, I have 3 advices for you, Ya Umar. He says, what is this? He says, number 1, when you celebrate, make sure you do not transgress the laws of Allah. Make sure you do not go towards haram. Stick with the halal. Limit yourself within what is halal. Joy, jubilation is part and parcel of our lives. There are days when we celebrate, but sometimes there are elements of haram that enter our forms of celebration. Weddings is a famous example. Marriage, a union between a husband and a wife is sanctified by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To the extent that the mu'mineen who witness that marriage, their du'as and their hajats are accepted. Why would anyone want to start a sanctified marriage that is based on spirituality through haram? That's something that's completely baffling. He says the second piece of advice, when you get angry, do not transgress. Do not start taking away. Do not start directing this anger upon others. Anger is a natural emotion, but control it. Keep it confined. Channel it in the right methods. Number 3, do not take away the rights of others. As a caliph, this advice was very much convenient for Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. So you find that the Imam alayhi salam began to work with the people on the ground. When he would act in charitable cases, for example, he would be altruistic, looking after the people financially. They say that the people of Medina were boycotted by the Bani Umayyah. Poverty was rampant. They would come towards the sons of Rasulullah and they would seek help from the Imams and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. You find, for example, in terms of akhlaq, in terms of knowledge, the Imam began to open the doors of knowledge. The reason why he's known as Baqir al-Ilm is why? Because he split open knowledge. When you refer to the words of certain scholars, you find, for example, An-Nawawi. You find, for example, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi. Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi very interestingly says certain things about Imam Baqir. When he speaks about Imam Baqir as a personality, he says that he was pure. He was considered to be one of the best in terms of knowledge, the ulama in Medina. But then at the same time, when he speaks about him, he says that he was worthy of being a caliph. If given the opportunity, he would have been the best candidate for khilafah. But in terms of his position with respects to Al-Qatada, for example, in narrations and narrating ahadith, he wasn't of the level of Qatada. You see, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi had this animosity towards the Shia in general. And whenever he would heighten the position of the Ahlul Bayt, he would also try and attack them in very subtle ways. Al-Qatada ibn Da'amat al-Basri, there's a very interesting incident that takes place between him and the Imam alayhi salam. The Imam in Medina, Qatada comes all the way from Basra. When he comes to Basra, he goes towards Masjid al-Nabi. When he is in Masjid al-Nabi, he approaches a person. He sees a person engaging in salah. After the person finishes his salah, he approaches him. He says, Ya ibadallah, O servant of Allah, salamun alaykum, alaykum salam. He says, where can I find Abi Ja'far Al-Baqir alayhi salam? Where can I find the Imam? The person he was talking to was Abu Hamza Thumali. So Abu Hamza responds to him. He says, what is your need from him? What affairs do you have? What do you want from the Imam alayhi salam? He says, don't worry. It's just that I have a few questions and I wish them to be clarified. So Abu Hamza looks around. He sees a gathering, a halaqah taking place. The Imam is sitting. There are companions surrounded him. They're asking, they're engaging in Q&A. He tells Qatada, he says, go over there. That's where you'll find the Imam alayhi salam. So Qatada goes, he silently joins the Q&A session and he's witnessing, he's observing now. He's watching how people, it was the time for Hajj, people had come to Medina before going towards Mecca to ask the Imam all of the ahkam in relation to Hajj. So they were having a Q&A session with regards to Hajj. So he sat down, he was observing the questions that were being asked, the answers that were being given. Very interestingly, when it finishes, Qatada then approaches the Imam alayhi salam. The Imam looks at him and he says, you're one of the scholars again from Basra, aren't you? He says, I am. He says, why have you come here? He says, I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind, if you can give me the answers for them. He says, Ya Qatada, when he begins to mention Qatada's name, there is a period of silence, a long period of silence. The Imam asks him something, but then Qatada doesn't respond. He lowers his head and with utmost humility, he's just there sitting in front of the Imam alayhi salam. Qatada later when he was asked, he said, what were you feeling when you were sitting with the Imam alayhi salam? He said, my heart was palpitating in ways I couldn't imagine. I've sat with the leading scholars of Basra and all over. I used to challenge them, debate them, answer their questions, critique them to the best of my ability. My heart would never shudder the way it did when I sat in front of the Imam alayhi salam. When there was that period of silence, the Imam alayhi salam turns to Qatada. He says, Qatada, why are you silent? There's no response. He says, Qatada, do you know whose presence you're sitting in front of? He says, tell me, Ibn Rasulullah. He says, Buyutin adinallahu an turfa an yudhkara fiha ismuh. You're sitting in a presence which the walls have been lifted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The house that you're sitting in has been raised by Allah. The members of that household, يُسَبِّحُ لَهُ فِيهَا بِالْغُدُوِّ وَالْآصَالِ, they engage in the tasbih of Allah day and night. You're not sitting in any random house or any random person. You've come towards those who represent Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those who have carried the wilayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested physically in this world. Qatada then, after he says, Saddaqta yabna Rasulullah, this house is not the house of al-hijara wa teen. It's not the houses that you and I see made of stone and clay and mud and so on and so forth. It's a house that is spiritually established by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Imam alayhi salam, through the proliferation of knowledge, was now reigniting the love of the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Given the opportunity, the Imam would always come back to the single point. It was Ali alayhi salam who should have been followed, and he should have never been abandoned. Given the opportunity, the Imam would always highlight the fada'il of the Imam alayhi salam, of his grandfather. And there are many examples to this. One particular example, they say, Imam Hassan al-Askari salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. I'll end with this hadith inshallah. Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam narrates from Imam Baqir, who narrates from his father Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. So Imam Baqir alayhi salam in Medina, Masjid al-Nabi, he's sitting, and the people have gathered around him. He then begins to praise the Imam alayhi salam of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's praising him, mentioning his fada'il. But there is one particular fadila he mentions, a very interesting one. He says, during the time of Tabuk, the battle of Tabuk, it's the only battle that the Imam did not engage in terms of warfare, in terms of battle. The Prophet requested that the Imam is to remain in Medina. Why? Because in Medina, the movement of the hypocrites emerged. It became strong. It was a threat. They had to be subsided. So the Imam alayhi salam is left behind in Medina by the orders of Rasulullah. The Imam is upset that he's unable to join the Holy Prophet in war. So he comes towards the Prophet, he begs the Prophet. He says, Ya Rasulullah, I do not wish to disobey you. I can't find it in myself to remain in Medina when you go out there in warfare. I would rather be there standing alongside you, fighting for you, defending you. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi replies back, he says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He says, Ya Ali, if you remain in Medina, the spiritual reward that you will receive is as if you were to accompany me in battle and to be in the front lines. You're needed here more than you are needed in the battlefield. So the Imam remains. But before they depart, the Imam says to the Holy Prophet of Islam, he says that my separation from you I cannot bear. It's not something that I'm able to handle. The level of love, the level of affection that was there between these two individuals, it's not something we can understand. The Holy Prophet says to him, he says, as a result, as a solution to this, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the veils from your eyes, to sharpen your eyes, so that you're able to see me and my companions whilst we are there in Tabuk. So whilst you're in Medina, you'd be able to see me and my soldiers and my companions. Now the Imam alayhi salam is mentioning this fadila of the Imam alayhi salam, of Amir al-Mu'mineen, in public. When he mentions this, one of the people listening to Imam Baqir alayhi salam stands up and he says, well, how is that even possible? How is that even possible? So the Imam replies back, he says, during the period of Tabuk, when the Prophet told the Imam to remain behind, he said to him, Ya Ali, your responsibilities are like the responsibilities of Harun in return to Musa alayhi salam. Anta minni bimanzalati Harun min Musa. You have a responsibility as well. When I leave, you are my successor. You are my representative. I need you in Tabuk. The Imam then goes on to explain, he says that this was the miracle of Rasulullah, that he himself personally, out of his own volition, asked Allah to remove the veils from the eyes of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And then Imam Baqir alayhi salam, he lowers his head and then he's in the state of sadness, in the state of grief. He says, look at how they treat you, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Look at how these people are treating you. When it comes to the fada'il of the caliphs, no problem whatsoever. But when it comes to the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen, they have 1,000 questions. So one of them heard this. He said, well, what do you mean by this? He says that when it comes to Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman, you proudly say that we befriend those who had friended them. And we are enemies of those who are considered to be the enemies of the three caliphs. But when it comes to Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, you do not befriend the friends of Amir al-Mu'mineen and you do not consider the enemies of the Imam alayhi salam as his enemies. See, your attitude towards the Imam is completely different. And then Imam Baqir alayhi salam, he proceeds and he begins to say this. He says that with regards to one of the fadila of Umar ibn al-Khattab, you've heard about Ya Sariya? The companions, they said yes. He said, what is this Ya Sariya? When Umar ibn al-Khattab, the narration mentions that Umar ibn al-Khattab, one day in Medina, as the caliph, he sat on the minbar and he began to deliver a sermon. When he was delivering the sermon, in the middle of the sermon, he stops and he screams, he shouts, Ya Sariya, move to the mountain. Ya Sariya, move to the mountain, loudly. So the people are baffled. It's like, what is he saying? After he finished his sermon, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he steps down from the minbar. They came, they approached him and they said, what was the words that you said? They didn't mean anything. It doesn't hold any meaning for us. What were you saying? He said, you don't know what happened to me. Whilst I was delivering the sermon, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unveiled my eyes and I could see my brethren fighting in the lands of Nahavand. They were being circulated by the enemies. The enemies had approached them in such a way that they were completely aloof. And this army was led by Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. It's as if I saw them and I saw the enemies. And if they had progressed the way they were doing, they would have completely been annihilated. There was a mountain there by the name of Sariya. So I shouted, go towards the Mount Sariya. Stay there, take refuge behind this mountain so that when the enemies circulate from the mountain towards you, you can attack them. When this battalion came back, they then began to report this. They said all of a sudden, whilst we were heading towards Nahavand, we saw the enemy, we knew that we had been outnumbered, strategically we were at loss, we didn't know what to do. But then all of a sudden we heard a voice saying, Ya Sariya, move to the mountain. And that was the voice of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. He highlights this to the people that were sitting there. Today there are ulama who believe in this hadith, by the way. If you go on Google, for example, you type in Ya Sariya, move to the mountain, narration by Umar ibn al-Khattab, there's a slight discussion as to what is the meaning of what the words of Umar ibn al-Khattab. But when you look at the historical, intellectual history of this hadith, majority of them believe what happened. And then the Imam alayhi salam says, with regards to Umar ibn al-Khattab, you believe that Allah unveiled his eyes and he was given a level of mukashifa. But that same level of mukashifa, when applied to Amir al-Mu'mineen, you have questions, you doubt him. This is intellectual. The Imam alayhi salam, he highlights this. He says that when it comes to the Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, you question his maqam. But when it comes to all the others, you accept them as if it's something that is part and parcel of the religion of Islam. The debates of Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam, the debates of the Imam alayhi salam was an opportunity for him to highlight and to announce the people the profundity and the maqam of the Ahl al-Bayt on this earth. One last debate. How long do we have? It's the debate with the Christian. The debate with the Christian. The spiritual aspect of this debate is something that is unimaginable. It's a simple debate, but when you go into the intricacies of this debate, the spiritual aspects of it is something unbelievable. When the Christian approached Imam Baqir alayhi salam, he said, I have 2 questions for you. There are more questions, but for the sake of time, 2 questions. He says, number 1, you Muslims believe that when you enter Jannah, you will eat and eat and eat, but you will never need to go towards the restroom. How is that even possible? I'll explain why this question is a very intricate question. And then there was a follow-up question that was made by the Christian. It's intricate because the world that we live in is a physical world. For everything there is an effect. Behind every effect there is a cause. Islam tells us that behind everything that is physical there is a spiritual element. The problem here is that our aql, we cannot understand spirituality or the spiritual world that has been created by Allah. We can't understand. Everything that we know of, you can create an alien, you can create a monster, you'll find that eventually you have created something that you have observed somewhere else. The human mind is not capable of thinking beyond the physical world. That's our limitation. That's our capacity as human beings. We don't know anything about the spiritual world. What is the ruh? What are the specifications of the ruh? What strengthens the ruh? What weakens the ruh? We don't know because it's not physical. Regardless of how advanced science becomes, it never has the power to understand what the ruh is. Why? Because the ruh is not physical. Science only has the power to observe the physical world, not the spiritual world. Our minds cannot understand the spiritual world. When it comes to Jannah and the pleasures of paradise, they're not just physical. The pleasures of paradise are emotional, psychological, and spiritual. You know, sometimes you have people say this, yes? You Muslims, you believe that you'll be given a banana in Jannah. So what's the big deal in that? I have a banana here. You know, the wine, the meat, the fruits. Yeah, we have it in dunya as well. What's so significant about Jannah? The physical pleasures of Jannah is the rudimentary basic pleasures. Beyond that, you have the emotional, spiritual, psychological rewards. If you as a human being today, you have a lot of pressure, you're under stress, you're under anxiety, I can give you the best of food, you still won't be able to enjoy it. Without that level of serenity, which is the highest maqam in Jannah, to have utmost peace, that is a spiritual reward that is given to the mu'mineen, spiritual peace. That's why we have within the narrations that on the day of judgment, the mu'mineen who engage in the tears of Abi Abdullah, they'll be raised alongside the Ahlul Bayt. What's significant about that? To be accompanying the Ahlul Bayt is the maqam of peace and serenity. There is no worries whatsoever. It's the highest pleasures that a person can attain in Jannah. So he asks Imam Baqir alayhi salam. He says, you will eat and eat and eat, but you will never need the restroom. How is that even possible? So what he was doing, he was now conflating what happens in dunya to what happens in the hereafter. And then he follows it up. He says, give me an example of it in dunya. The Imam alayhi salam says to him, he says, the way a fetus is in the womb of the mother. It is nourished by the mother, but it never releases the waste. It's beautiful because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He describes the pleasures of Jannah, He gives us a little synopsis of it within dunya. He says, with regards to the second question, tell me, how do you Muslims say that you will eat and eat and eat and whatever that is given to you will never deplete? Again, his understanding was that he was now trying to interpret the spiritual world using the physical world. That was a mistake on his behalf. And then he says, show me an example in dunya. The Imam alayhi salam says, with regards to the pleasures of heaven, when they're given, yes, it never lessens for the person. Just as how when you take a candle and the fire of that candle, you can light 1,000 candles. But that original first candle and the ignition of it, it never depletes, it never lessens. Again, the pleasures of paradise with regards to the spiritual world, a little small synopsis of it is given to us in dunya. This is the magnitude and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam Baqir alayhi salam, given the opportunity, would always emphasize on the authority of the Ahlul Bayt. That's why he goes out and he says, go towards the west and the east, you will not find knowledge except that emanates from us. With regards to how we live our lives, it ought to be alongside, or it ought to be with the premise of the worldview of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And through it, you will see peace, you will see serenity, you will see barakat being given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a night like this, through the wasila of Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, to cure those who are sick, to help those who are oppressed, to give them patience, to give them strength, to bless our marhumin, to allow them to reach the maqam and to accompany the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Wa akhir da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allahumma salli ala
İlahi bebimar daşte bala jo bimar ho jald pawe shafa İlahi baraye imam zaman हमें गौल माशा से दे तू अमा क़यामत को माशो रग़बाली उठे कब्र से कह के गम याली ए पांच वना मिल चगा दहतान अहमद वाली ज़हरा व हसन शबीर से ले ताइमाम ज़मान शबीर से ले ताइमाम ज़मान एक पे सदा सलवात पढ़ो सलवात सलवात के उस पे निसारे गोग़ैर जो नबी ग़ै बुलंद दर सिफ़ात हुए सलवात सलवात व सलाम या इमाम ज़मान फरमाओ ज़ुहूर या इमाम ज़मान सलाम السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد الوسيين السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولى وابن مولى. السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء. السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء. السلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا، كن شفيعنا وشفيع والدينا في يوم الجزاء. وفقنا الله لزيارتك يا مولاي، وارزقنا الله شفاعتك في الدنيا والآخرة. السلام عليك وعلى أختك فاطمة المعصومة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان، سيدي الأمان الأمان الأمان من فتنة الزمان من شر الزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجك، وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة، وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. الله. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.